I would now like to ask our interpreters to get ready so that we can start promptly whenever you would like, Mr. President.
I'm ready to start now, Rox. Okay.
Excellent. Then we can go.
Okay. Well, it's by the way, it's morning here in Washington, but I know it's afternoon where you are. Welcome everybody to the Rose Roth webinar on the South Caucasus, and a warm welcome to our four speakers. This is our first online meeting after the successful conclusion, also online, of our 66th annual session, and it's a pleasure to be back at this first meeting as your new president. The meeting is an opportunity to reiterate the U.S. Congress's continued commitment to the Rose Roth program, a bipartisan initiative designed by the late Congressman Charlie Rose and Senator Bill Roth of Delaware as a way to support democratic transition and stability in NATO's neighborhood. The goals of the Rose Roth initiative remain fully valid and important for our Assembly today. I intend to make commitment to democratic values a key priority of my presidency. As members of the Alliance, we must re-educate ourselves to these common values, rededicate ourselves to these common values. This will make NATO stronger internally and externally. It will give us more credibility and influence in our relations with our partners. There has to be a clear alternative to the Putin-Russian model. And that alternative has to be one of robust commitment to robust democratic liberal values. NATO's partnerships and open door policy have helped expand stability in our neighborhood. However, many challenges remain, first among which Russia's ongoing aggression and illegal occupation of parts of the sovereign territories of Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova. Its actions to prevent these and other countries from freely deciding their future course, and its ongoing control over other parts of the region under the guise of peacekeeping. All these themes and challenges are relevant for our discussions today, which will focus on the situation in the three countries of the South Caucasus: Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. As a co-chair of the Congressional Caucus in Georgia, I have followed developments in Tbilisi closely this past year, partly with concern and partly with hope. Georgia just completed important parliamentary elections, which were seen by many as a test of the country's political maturity. As you know, a NATO PA delegation led by our colleague, Osman Bat from Turkey, observed the first round of these elections on October 31. Their assessment was mixed. They welcomed a generally free and well-run process while highlighting a number of shortcomings that need to be addressed. The election opened a serious political crisis, with the opposition refusing to take its seats in the new parliament. Overcoming this political impasse is crucial for Georgia's democratic future and for its Euro-Atlantic integration. This can only be achieved by creating the conditions for dialogue and trust between the majority and the opposition. I look forward to hearing our speakers' assessment about the way forward. Turning to Armenia and Azerbaijan, much has happened since the last webinar we held on the crisis in Nagorno-Karabakh in October. Azerbaijan and Armenia have been engaged in a deadly 6-week war that has claimed the lives of thousands of people on both sides, displaced many more, and caused severe and lasting destruction. The ceasefire agreement brokered by Russian President Vladimir Putin on November 10th has put an end to the violence for now, but leaves many questions unanswered. It also enables the deployment of so-called Russian peacekeepers, which will give Russia additional leverage in its relations with both countries. Even if neither NATO nor the Assembly have a direct role in the resolution of the conflict over Nagorno-Karabakh, these recent developments obviously are on the radar of our Assembly. The fighting has stopped for now, but now must come a time of de-escalation and responsible behavior and rhetoric. Ultimately, the region needs a long-term solution under the auspices of the Minsk Group to finally bring lasting peace and stability. Here again, I look forward to hearing from our speakers. We're privileged to have with us three experienced experts on the region. Amanda Paul, Senior Policy Analyst of the European Policy Center, Dennis Sammet, Director of Links Europe and a frequent contributor to our Rose Roth seminars, and lastly, Neil Melvin, Director of International Security Studies at RUSI in London. Amanda will first kick off a discussion with Mr. Sammet and Dr. Melvin. We'll then open the floor for general discussion. But before handing the floor to Amanda, I'd like to welcome and introduce Ambassador Philippe Brandt, head of the Swiss mission to NATO. Mr. Ambassador, this gives us an opportunity to thank you, and through you, the Swiss government, for its ongoing support for the Rose Roth Initiative. Please be welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to thank you, Mr. Chair, as President of the NATO PA, for inviting me to say a few words and to introduce today's Rose Roth webinar on the post-pandemic situation in the South Caucasus. Let me also welcome our speakers, Mr. Dennis Sammet, Director of our Links Europe, and Mr. Neil Melvin, Director of our International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute, as well as our moderator, Mrs. Amanda Paul. Mr. Chair, dear colleagues, Switzerland has always actively supported the Rose Roth program as a unique platform of dialogue for enhancing the cooperation between the parliaments of NATO member states and partner states, as well as for the promotion of our common democratic values and their reflection on the security sector. The latter has always been a priority for Switzerland, as the establishment of the Geneva Center for Security Sector Governance, called DCAF, in 2000 underlines. From the very beginning, DCAF has supported the Rose Roth program continuously, and we are grateful for their partnership. Mr. Chair, dear colleagues, today's discussion will focus on a region that has been confronted with tensions for decades and has yet again experienced the outbreak of an armed conflict. Switzerland called repeatedly for an immediate stop of the violence and full compliance with international humanitarian law. Mid-October, we allocated 1 million Swiss francs for humanitarian operations of the International Committee of the Red Cross in the region. And we welcome that the Russian brokered ceasefire of 10 November is still respected, and trust that the parties to the conflict will reach a peaceful, long-term solution. But before passing the floor to our today's experts, let me say a few words about Switzerland's engagement in South Caucasus. First of all, European security is closely interlinked. Instability and conflict in one region have direct consequences for the rest of Europe. Therefore, it must be our priority to jointly find peaceful solutions to conflicts and to address our shared security challenges together. Consequently, Switzerland supports the ongoing efforts of the international community towards peace and stability in the South Caucasus. These include the efforts of the OSCE as well as those of NATO. In this respect, Switzerland has supported different NATO trust funds for Armenia and Azerbaijan in the field of the destruction of small arms and light weapons and ammunition, as well as different security sector reform projects in Georgia. My country is also actively engaged in the region through its international cooperation programs in the South Caucasus. In this respect, the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation has been focusing on inclusive and sustainable economic development and supported the promotion of democratic institutions, in particular by building capacities at the local administrative level. In future endeavors, a strong focus will also be put on strengthening resilience to the consequences of climate change. Mr. Chair, dear colleagues, I hope that our exchange today will serve as a contribution towards fostering a common understanding of the challenges faced by South Caucasus, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic and its consequences. I wish us all a successful and engaging webinar. Thank you for your attention and pass the floor back to you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And again, thank you and the Swiss government for your consistent support for Rose Roth. I think it really makes a big difference. We really appreciate it. I'd now like to turn to Amanda Paul to manage the next part of our meeting. Amanda is a senior policy analyst in the Europe and the World program of the European Policy Center. She has well-established expertise on issues related to Turkish foreign and domestic policy, Ukraine, security and conflict resolution of the Black Sea region, Russian foreign policy in the former Soviet space, and EU foreign policy in its eastern neighborhood. Amanda, the floor is yours.
And Amanda, please, if you could request to speak, and we'll bring you up on screen. Here she is.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this part of the seminar. It's a great pleasure to be with you all today. I'd like to start this Q&A with the speakers. I think we have about 30 minutes and quite a lot of ground to cover. So I'd like to start by asking you, Dennis, if you could give us a picture of the domestic situation in all three Caucasus states following the Karabakh War on the one hand and the recent elections in Georgia, which have thrown the country into crisis on the other.
So Dennis has requested the floor. We'll bring you up on screen. Dennis, we can't hear you. You need to activate your micro. Yeah.
How about now?
Yeah, it works.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be participating in this webinar. Normally, over a number of years, I participated in actual events of the Rose Roth seminars, but I'm delighted that we could find a way of doing this event even in these difficult circumstances. And indeed, it has been a very difficult year for the South Caucasus. 2020 perhaps is the most challenging year for the region since the early 1990s. The pandemic has hit hard, and the economic fallout of the pandemic now pile up on other economic difficulties that had been seen and emerging even before the pandemic struck. And then, of course, to end it all, in the last weeks, we had the 44-day war in and around Nagorno-Karabakh. So the pandemic came at a very sensitive time for all three countries, because for Georgia, 2020 was election year, and so we have seen over the last year pandemic and politics blending together. The Georgians initially had quite a lot of success in dealing with the first wave of the pandemic by imposing a very strict lockdown, but this had huge economic costs, especially on the tourism sector, which is increasingly important for Georgia. So they had to open up, and then the result is that now the second wave is hitting much, much harder. And in the middle of this pandemic, there was also an election campaign, a rather tough election campaign, which saw the two big rivals of Georgian politics, Bidzina Ivanishvili and his Georgian Dream Party, and Mikhail Saakashvili's and United National Movement, contesting a very tough election. These two men continue to dominate Georgian politics. Between them, on 31st of October, they won 75% of the votes. Although there are a lot of other parties now elected to be in the Georgian parliament, indeed 8 opposition parties were elected to be in the Georgian parliament, but the votes just show that the polarization around these two personalities remains very high. What has happened after 31st of October is that whilst the international observers gave overall a positive assessment of the election result, the opposition is claiming that the vote was rigged and they did not participate in the second round of the vote, and they are refusing to enter parliament. I have to say that domestic observers of the elections also were much more critical of the election process than were the international observers. But on the whole, the international community has stuck with the conclusions of the ODIHR and other international observation missions. And really the recommendation to Georgian opposition politicians, many of whom are very pro-Western and pro-European and pro-NATO, is that in the interest of their country, they really need to find a way out of this impasse very quickly, because Georgia needs a strong parliament, it needs a strong opposition, but it also needs strong institutions ahead of what is going to be a very difficult time ahead in the coming months, because Georgia faces very serious economic challenges, and it also faces continuous Russian provocations. Maybe we can talk about this a bit later. Now, Azerbaijan at the beginning of the year was in the middle of a complicated reform process. There were changes of personnel. In some people who had been in very strong entrenched positions for a very long time were replaced. There was an opening up to a new generation of more professional people taking key positions in government. And there was also an emphasis on the need for reform in the economy, particularly to increase the role of the non-oil sector in the economy, because oil prices were going down, and this had very serious budgetary implications. So the pandemic somehow overshadowed all these processes, but some important things still went on. For example, the consolidation of government investments into a holding company, which is supposed to play a very important role in the economic transformation going forward now, was, in my view, quite a positive step. But others say that the process of reform is going too slowly and is not going to be able to achieve what it's supposed to achieve. I will talk about the war in a second, but I will go to Armenia, where Pashinyan's government at the beginning of the year was in the middle of consolidating its position and had announced a referendum on judicial reforms in April. The pandemic hit hard in Armenia, much harder in the first wave than it did in Georgia. The medical system appeared to be under great stress. And so the referendum was cancelled, and the conversation appeared to be moving on in other directions. Now, Pashinyan, this is very important to remember, especially in the particular moment where we are. Pashinyan has the support of the grassroots, but the political and social elites in Yerevan overall detest him. So even before the pandemic, even before the war, he appeared embattled. Of course, since the last few weeks, things have developed in a very dramatic way, with the war that started on the 27th of September, which lasted for 44 days. It resulted in a loss of life of between 5,000 and 8,000 people. These are estimates because we don't really have very accurate data at the moment. But Azerbaijan won the war decisively, and it did so because it fought a modern war with modern weaponry. It had invested billions in armaments over the years, and had overhauled its military, including its command and control structures. Whilst Armenia fought a war in 2020, it seemed with the tactics of 1990. it became clear from early on that it had no chance militarily, but the political leadership was reluctant to admit defeat. And so the war dragged on until 9th of November, sorry, it had no choice but to sign the agreement that was put in front of them by the Russians, which leaves us where we are today. Now, Putin's peace is better than war, but it comes at a high price. That will become clear soon enough, but in the short term, over the next few months, Armenia and Azerbaijan have to deal with the aftermath, which includes also a lot of developments on the ground that are still not clear how they're going to play out. Psychologically, this has been a big victory for Azerbaijan. The entire nation feels that this has been a moment of liberation, a sense of relief because of the stigma of the defeat of the 1990s has now somehow been erased. And President Aliyev has never been as popular as he is now. He is considered to be the one who had the vision to see this through, and he delivered. And so we are seeing that actually Ilham Aliyev, for the first time, in a sense, since 2003, is emerging from under the shadow of his father. But many problems remain. Reforms must continue. The economy still has to be re-energized and refocused. And these territories that Azerbaijan has now taken over once more are by and large in a state of complete ruin, and they're going to require a big chunk of the country's efforts to be rebuilt from scratch. Conversely, for Armenia, the trauma of defeat has now started to sink in. There is a big difference, however, between the kind of trauma of defeat of Armenia in 2020 and of Azerbaijan in 1994. And this is due to the fact that, first of all, in Armenia, we are not seeing the mass exodus of refugees that actually we saw in Azerbaijan in 1994, where hundreds of thousands of people were displaced. So there are a few refugees from some areas that are in or around Nagorno-Karabakh, but certainly not on the scale that we saw in 1994. For Armenia, the problem is essentially a psychological one, because there are two Armenias. There is the Republic of Armenia, the country that exists, that is a member of the United Nations, but there is also Armenia, the idea, which is in the mind of the diaspora and the mind of all Armenians, even in Armenia and in Nagorno-Karabakh. But this is a very abstract idea. And the reconciliation between these two, the country and the idea, is something that somehow always ends up with some difficulties for Armenians. The war has been costly for all concerned, but there is a silver lining. It has opened up the prospects for peace and for regional cooperation. But to achieve both these two things, huge work needs to be done. Before that can happen, the 9th November agreement needs to be put into an international framework. This could mean the United Nations Security Council resolution legitimizing the peacekeeping force that has been sent there by Russia within hours. And although on the one hand, these peacekeepers were needed, on the other hand, nobody expected that these peacekeepers would be deployed without a United Nations Security Council resolution, which was always on the agenda. If there was ever to be a peacekeeping force in Nagorno-Karabakh, it was always to be with a UN Security Council resolution backing it. And there are other issues related to this agreement, and I hope that we can come back to them shortly in a second round of questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dennis.
Dear colleagues, apologies for the technical issues. We seem to have lost Amanda. My camera also seems to not be working. So we're trying to solve these problems. Amanda, if you could request the floor again. And if I could ask Dr. Neil Melvin as well to request the floor at this point, then we can get everybody on screen.
Can you hear me now?
Here we go.
Yes? Okay, I'm sorry. So I won't repeat what I just said in case everybody has already heard it once. But I'm going to ask you, Neil, to focus on Russia and the new situation around Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, Russia has been called a winner in the new situation. But when we look at the policy and tactics of Russia, I'd like you to analyze whether Russia responded cautiously to the new situation, waiting to get involved sometime. Was Russia playing a sort of long game before stepping up to broker the ceasefire and deploying its peacekeepers? Or was Russia sort of caught off balance and unprepared by Turkey's dramatic change of approach towards the conflict? And also, perhaps you can also add, some analysts have said that Russia and its role in the South Caucasus is actually declining. This was the position even a few months ago, but I mean, this new situation doesn't seem to reflect this view. Or is Russia perhaps overstretching itself? I'll give the floor to you, Neil.
Thank you very much, Amanda. Just to check, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. No, thanks very much for those questions, and thank you very much to the organisers for the opportunity to speak today. I mean, as you say, there's been a lot of discussion about Russia's role in the conflict and what the outcome of that is. I think in my remarks, I'd like to begin with actually, I think we need to look at this conflict in a wider context, and that is that up until relatively recently, I would say that the South Caucasus has tended to be viewed as really having two options. One was the Euro-Atlantic integration, and the other one was the Eurasian integration option. The latter one, of course, being led by Russia with its various institutions. I think what this conflict has highlighted is that the post-Soviet space has entered a new phase now, in which increasingly those two options are no longer the only options, and indeed both of them are seen to have quite significant shortcomings. Perhaps we can sort of turn a little bit to the Western experience of this conflict later on in our discussion, but obviously during the Karabakh crisis, the Western countries were largely marginalized. But Russia also, as you highlighted in your questions, I think, struggled around this conflict. And Russia indeed is now beginning to face the fact that the post-Soviet space is increasingly a multipolar space. The Euro-Atlantic community has made significant inroads over the last couple of decades. We also see China playing a stronger role in Central Asia. And what the conflict in Karabakh has highlighted is that Turkey is now a major actor, and not just in the South Caucasus, but in the broader Black Sea region. Turkey is advancing its own agenda towards Georgia, towards Azerbaijan and Armenia, but also it's reaching out strongly to Ukraine. So this was really, I think, the strategic choice that Russia faced as this conflict unrolled was really, would it try and stick to its previous position, which was built around being a balancing force with the long-term aim that a final peace agreement would be one that Russia would essentially mediate and largely shape, including putting its own forces on the ground, which would allow it to remain the leading force in the South Caucasus and to some degree cut out the Western community? Or would it have to take account of the rise of Turkey? So initially, I think Russia was really caught off balance by this, and it stayed largely on the margins. It tried to organize, first of all, its own ceasefire initiative, and then working particularly with France and to some degree with the US around other initiatives. All of those failed, and throughout that period, of course, Azerbaijan continued to make ground militarily, as Dennis has rightly highlighted. But I would say, I mean, alongside the military successes of Azerbaijan, fundamental was the political relationship between Azerbaijan and Turkey, which really shifted the whole political dynamics around the conflict, and in particular weakened Russia's leverage. So eventually we got to the point where Russia faced the prospect, together with Armenia, of Azerbaijan and Turkey essentially overrunning most of Nagorno-Karabakh. And that's the point that we see a shift from Russia. So Russia has abandoned its former position on this conflict. It's given up on its ability to balance between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And so this is why I think it's quite right not to call these Russian forces peacekeepers. They are deployed not as a keeping the peace operation, and not indeed even as a buffer force, but they are a force that is deployed within what's left of Karabakh, the Rump Karabakh, as a force to protect the Armenian community there. So they are patrolling within Karabakh, they're not outside its territory. Beyond that, Azerbaijan has reclaimed its territory, and of course we see a very difficult negotiation underway now about Turkey's role in the conflict settlement, or the ceasefire mechanism anyway. Now, there's a lot of focus on technically whether Turkey will be allowed to patrol the ceasefire line, but the reality is that's, I think, a second-order question, because Turkey and Azerbaijan have their own bilateral military agreements, so Turkey can deploy military forces to Azerbaijan in other formats. It can establish bases in Azerbaijan if Azerbaijan agrees to that. So we now have Russia shifting from its former position as the leading force in the South Caucasus to what looks to me like quite a gamble in a way. It's put these forces on the ground. It's put them on the ground when there is no peace agreement. There's no certainty about the final status of Karabakh. And indeed, Azerbaijan, together with Turkey, holds most of the cards militarily on this conflict. And Russia has been forced to cede that it will allow Turkey to have this role. There'll be a land corridor connecting Turkey to Azerbaijan across Armenia. So I think there's quite a lot to play for now on the Russian side. And while the Russians may have achieved what has been their long-term aim, I think the fact that they've achieved this in a very different context completely changes that power balance. It's far from clear now what Russia can achieve. They've really taken responsibility for a conflict that they can't actually resolve. I mean, the power to resolve that conflict lies elsewhere. But I think also what we're likely to see increasingly is that other regional actors, such as Iran, are going to want to have a louder voice in the region as they see that international mechanisms are playing less and less a role, and it's more about regional geopolitics. So this is all shifting into a far more complex picture, and Russia is having to adapt and find a new way in this particular context. And I think my last point here is I think we see that in the way that Russia reacted to this. There wasn't a sense of victory in Russia about this achievement. In fact, for the first week or so, the Russian authorities were very much on the defensive. There was a lot of quite critical comment in the Russian press. And Russia has been forced to actually accept a much more defined role as a result of this conflict. It's been clear that its security guarantees only apply to Armenia. It doesn't have a reach beyond that. It's accepted, and Putin has underlined this, that Azerbaijan's territorial integrity is the basis of an agreement. So there's no ambiguity there. Russia has really cut itself out of playing a role beyond that border. And so we now have a moment in which Russia is trying to remake a new position for itself around this conflict. And this is why I think that it's really fundamental that the Western community begins to take account of what is a new situation. Now, it's right, of course, that the Minsk process is part of that, but that is clearly not going to be sufficient. It hasn't been sufficient for the last 30 years. It was almost completely marginalized in the conflict. In the case of France, France, I think, has been discredited for many in Azerbaijan, which is going to make it very difficult to play the role of a mediator and a neutral force in the conflict. So I think from the Western community side, we're going to have to look much broader. The Minsk process is going to have to be put in a broader geopolitical effort, likely being led by the United States under President-elect Biden, we hope, and the Europeans coming in around that. But it's going to have to be a much higher level engagement than we've seen over recent years. Back to you, Amanda.
Apologies for this again. We've lost Amanda again. Let's try to bring her back. She's on her way, so we should see her on screen shortly. Amanda.
I don't know. Okay. Sorry for this. I would just like to stay with you, Neil, for a second, just to elaborate a bit on this role of Turkey. I agree with all that you said, but just in terms of Turkey's longer-term relationship with Azerbaijan, I mean, now Turkey is viewed as a hero in the country. To what extent could Turkey's growing political, economic and military influence on Azerbaijan actually impact Azerbaijan in the longer term, positive or negatively? And also in terms of the relationship between Turkey and Russia, I mean, they're sort of flexible rivals, but how is this relationship sustainable in the long run? So I'll give the floor back to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. And I mean, as you say, of course, underlining my comments is that Turkey's role has been fundamental. It's part of a wider strategy, and that's why I began my comments by saying I think we have to look at this in a broader context, because what the ceasefire agreement and Turkey's growing role shows is that now the South Caucasus has to be considered to be part of the Middle East. And this, of course, may be where some of the negative impact on Azerbaijan may eventually emerge, because the ultimate fate now of Karabakh is also tied in to Turkey's position in Syria, Turkey's position in the East Mediterranean and Libya, Turkey's broader vision of its role in the Black Sea region. It's not an isolated situation here. So Turkey is expanding its relationships. And of course, even on the agreement about Turkey's involvement in the ceasefire, we see that this is a bilateral agreement between Russia and Turkey that's being negotiated, of course, in cooperation with Azerbaijan, but Azerbaijan is not party to that. So this, I think, shows that there are now different levels of relationships emerging across the region, in which the Russia-Turkey relationship is a central one, and the other countries risk taking on, to some degree, a proxy role in those larger issues. And particular decisions around Karabakh will, of course, be linked to decisions about the Turkish relationship in the broader Middle East. Now, that may, of course, lead to tensions all along the line, but what it does also mean is that Azerbaijan's fate is also very much in the hands of the personal relationship between the two presidents, the Russian president and the Turkish president, and the fates of those two countries and their broader relationship. So I think that, I mean, this is a ceasefire, but as we've seen, the conflict is not ended. The conflict will continue to evolve on the ground, and the Turkish-Russia relationship will continue to evolve on the ground around this conflict. And that's going to make a lot of difficult questions going forward about what a final settlement may look like, whose interest it's going to be in, and how it relates to those broader strategic questions that I raised earlier on.
Okay, thank you, Neil. I'd now like to come back to you, Dennis, and ask you how the 10th November agreement is viewed from the perspective of the EU and NATO.
Well, I think from the NATO perspective, the reality is that this agreement has introduced an additional Russian force in the South Caucasus. That is, I think, something that is starting to be understood now. As I understand, even the Ministerial Council of NATO tomorrow will discuss this issue. And that has implications for Georgia. And if there was a time when the issue of Georgian membership of NATO had to be brought back on the agenda, this is it. And I think if the Georgians can get their act together in Tbilisi with this political impasse, and I think they will, then it's going to be necessary to start very seriously looking at the issue of Georgia's NATO membership once again, because the dynamic in the region has changed. For the European Union, it's a little bit more complicated because the European Union approached this conflict with a basis that somehow did not enable it to engage properly. There is no clear European Union strategy for the South Caucasus. There are bits and pieces here and there, but there is no clear strategy for the region, certainly not of the sort of commitment that we see the European Union making towards the Balkans. And this conflict has exposed this weakness. What we saw in Brussels was not inertia on the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but paralysis. The European Union simply could not move, could not act. There was no basis on which it could get engaged in a political initiative to support an end to the war. So there were a lot of general statements, some of them, quite bizarre, but nothing really very substantial in terms of commitment. But for the European Union, the South Caucasus is important. And this is recognized, but what is not recognized is how to engage, how to deal with the region going forward. And I think there is now no longer any space for ambiguity. The European Union needs to take some clear decisions in order to identify its role. And there is a role, because as has been said, this issue of what happened on the 10th of November, the fact that this is not a peace, this is this situation can develop in all kinds of different ways. We will have to see how the political situation in Armenia is going to develop, because that will have an impact on whether the Armenian government, but not only the Armenian government, also other elements in Armenia are going to accept the reality of the 10th of November agreement, or if they're going to start questioning it, but not only questioning it politically, but also the risk that there will be elements who will try to question it even violently. And we cannot exclude this possibility. If we look back in history, we can see that this is a danger that can exist. So the stability of Armenia is now in the interest of everybody, including Azerbaijan. And the stability of the Caucasus is in the interest of everybody too. And this is where I think the European Union has now to step up and to say we're going to engage with the region very seriously at both the political and the economic level, not simply by throwing some money on it for humanitarian aid. This worked in the 1990s. It's not going to work in 2021. So we need a strategy, we need a vision, and the discussion on this needs to start. And I hope the colleagues, members of parliament in the different European parliaments will really push for this, because we can't expect Brussels to come with the answers. They don't seem to have one.
I think we've lost Amanda again, but I believe this was the end of our moderated discussion, Mr. President. So if, you'd like to take the floor back.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Amanda. I'm sorry we keep on losing you. Let me ask the first question, if I may. Two questions, really. One, Dennis, you just talked about the paralysis of the European Union response to the recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. We saw the same thing in the 90s in Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, that required intervention and insistence on the other side of the Atlantic, not on the European side. And I just wonder, what is it you think the European Union can and should do with respect to Nagorno-Karabakh? And my second question, and to both of you maybe, is longer term, how does Russia react to particularly the Turkish assertiveness in this most recent conflict, where Turkey is widely credited for providing drone technology that proved decisive on the Azerbaijani side and costing lots of Armenian lives. Longer term, how does Russia recalibrate a more assertive Turkey in its own backyard?
Okay, perhaps I will start. I will start with the last question. I think it's extremely important to understand Turkey is a Caucasus country. Its role in the region has been there for forever. There were moments when it was excluded. Well, during the time of the Soviet Union, because the borders were closed and the interactions were very minimal. And in the immediate aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, during the First Karabakh War, for example, the Turkish military were under great pressure from the United States military not to get involved, because at the time this would have really developed into something serious in terms of a confrontation with Russia. But Turkey-Russia relations are now on a completely different place. The two have many overlaps, and they have found some way, somehow, of managing these tensions and to get the best out of the situation. Partly because in very different ways, and I want to emphasize the very different ways, Turkey remains a valued member of NATO, but in some other ways there was also competition with the West for a number of reasons, even on the Turkish side. So this somehow creates a space for common ground, for common action, for trying to find solutions together and not to allow space for others to get involved. So you know, this situation may be short term, may be long term. But it's what we have at the moment. Now, regarding the European Union, as Neil mentioned a moment ago, what we have now in Nagorno-Karabakh is a situation where Russia has really declared a protectorate. So Nagorno-Karabakh joins Abkhazia and South Ossetia in different ways, but the dynamic is the same. A Russian army, a Russian military force, is there to ensure that nothing else happens. The European Union needs to remain engaged with the South Caucasus. It needs to have a nuanced position with the three different countries, because the three different countries are not on the same page. They're not in the same place. The agenda needs to be nuanced with each and every one of them, but there also needs to be a strategic regional approach. And I think what many in Europe are hoping is that the new US administration will come up with some initiatives, not only on the South Caucasus, but on the broader issue of European security. There's a huge amount of work that needs to be done. The institutions that are supposed to be there dealing with European security, like the OSCE, are themselves in a sort of crisis. And so it is hugely important that there will be a strong transatlantic cooperation on the South Caucasus going forward.
Perhaps if I could add to Dennis's comments. Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I broadly agree with Dennis. I think that, I mean, for the transatlantic community, we have two challenges now with the South Caucasus beyond the conflicts themselves. One is Russia and the other one is Turkey. So to me, I think if we take just an institution by institution approach, you know, NATO, European Union, this is not going to work because there is too much disagreement within those two institutions about how to deal with both of those countries. So it seems to me we need to forge a transatlantic consensus about how to approach the regional security challenges of this region. And I think we need to obviously begin with updating and finding a new way to bring Turkey closer to the European Union and to sort of re-energize its relationship with NATO, because obviously this is fraying quite badly at the moment. But we have a situation now in which a NATO member state is on a very unstable ceasefire line with Russian military forces now. So I think it's in NATO's own interests to clarify this relationship and build up a much closer sort of ties with Turkey so that we can coordinate and cooperate much more closely. Because we see it's not just about the South Caucasus. I mean, many, I think, of the post-Soviet states now are looking at the experience of the Karabakh conflict and at how conflicts can be unfrozen to their advantage. So Ukraine, of course, is also looking at buying Turkish drone technology and looking at ways to sort of the lessons learned from this. So we may begin to see a new dynamic around other of the so-called frozen conflicts as a result of what happened in Karabakh. So this needs to be put back into a multilateral framework. So if it's left or it accelerates processes in which regional powers are determining the outcomes of this conflict, this is going to be extremely detrimental to Western interests and may ultimately, of course, even fray some of those organizations. So, but I mean, and I would also agree with Dennis. I think the strategic framework for this engagement will need to come from the United States. The Europeans, I think, are not in a place where we can forge our own approach to this region. There would be too much disagreement about Russia and about Turkey and on particular issues. This needs to be a wider discussion and a joined up discussion about how to approach the region.
Thank you very much. And opening it up, I want to call our first questioner is our Vice President, Mimi Kadeli from Albania. Mimi.
Hello, everybody. Hi there. Well, I was trying to have my question, but I think that Neil was more than clear in what I was looking for or asking for. But anyway, I'm doing my question anyway. Do you think that by having different approaches within the NATO countries or within the EU is the reason why it seems that we as NATO or the EU need more time and more efforts to resolve issues rather than Russia, which is more effective when it comes to resolve situations like this? And I totally agree with you when you says that, yes, there is a name, there is an answer, such as the United States of America, which is the case of resolving the question of former Yugoslavia or Kosovo or all the Western Balkans when the others were not answering or were not listening at all to the issues. So do you think that we need to have close approaches to each other or need more strategies in tackling our differences and our different opinions and, and different processes to come to a common solution, rather than Russia? It's a one-man show. So he wake up in the morning, he watch himself into the mirror, and to decide what to do with Nagorno-Karabakh or the rest of the Caucasus. Thank you.
Neil or Dennis, do you want to react?
Okay, well, with regards to the European Union, it's clear the European Union has a very cumbersome decision-making process. This is being discussed in the context of the ambitions of the European Union to be more geostrategic in its approach and to take on responsibilities that it must take on in order to achieve objectives of the Union and of its member states. But the member states keep pushing in different directions. There is a consensus rule. So there is a problem with the process, which I think is part of the story. It's part of the reasons why the EU is always very slow in acting. But there is also an issue around building a consensus around a strategy for the region, because the strategy, for example, should include giving a membership perspective for Georgia, even if it's very far away in the future, and so on and so forth. So you don't need a strategy about only what to do with Nagorno-Karabakh. You need to know how you're going to deal with the region, how you're going to deal with the issues of European security more generally.
Yeah, I won't sort of repeat what Dennis was saying, but I just add perhaps two comments where I think the European Union could make an important difference, and NATO as well, actually, and that is one of the key outcomes of this conflict is that Armenia now is extremely isolated. It feels that its only protector is Russia, that many of the other options are off the table, that its historic sort of concerns about Turkey are coming true again. It now feels it may even be surrounded by Turkey, and that there is really no one else who's going to look after its interests. There's also question marks about the embryonic democratization process that Armenia experienced a couple of years ago. So I think this is a critical moment when we need to re-engage or reinvigorate our contacts with Armenia so that it feels that it can talk to the Western community without having to go through Moscow, which I think is a risk now, is that increasingly Armenia could fall and become a sort of simple proxy country in regards to Russia if it's left on its own. So I think we need to have an enhanced diplomacy and outreach to Armenia and working with Armenia, and to position particularly the European Union as an honest broker in the region and try to be the one who can support dialogue between the two countries, whereas NATO and the United States and the European countries, I think, can put together a far stronger political and security strategy across the region.
Thank you very much. Next is Ahmed Yildiz from Turkey.
Thank you, President Connolly, and congratulations for your election as President. Dear colleagues, my remarks will be in parallel to the remarks of President Connolly and Albanian colleague. Because of my experience on this issue, unavoidably this discussion took me to 90s. I was consul in Houston, Texas. These issues were very fresh. I wish at that time Armenia could be treated as Serbia or what they did in Bosnia and Kosovo, or like Iran, Iraq, or what they did in Kuwait. But unfortunately, it did not happen, mainly because of Russia at that time. Western community at that time, but especially Turkey and the United States, I cannot say the same for European Union and Europe, tried a lot to liberate these newly independent states from Russian sphere of influence. And the first instrument was at that time the pipeline from Caucasus to Europe, both oil and gas. Unfortunately, the only countries who were supporting this idea against Russia and Iran was United States and Turkey. Europe did nothing. Contrary, they opposed it at that time. Finally, together with the US, and especially with the support of Israel, we achieved this. It was one of them. During these 3 decades after that, unfortunately, Armenia didn't take any opportunity. They were offered a lot of opportunities in 2008-9 by Turkey to make some reconciliation, but they always refused it. They demanded unilateral action by Azerbaijan. Now we are here. It seems, of course, I am so sorry that Russia made another inroad, again gained some influence due to peacekeeping, but it is because of our incoherence. And we did nothing during these 3 decades to implement these UN Security Council resolutions. Partly, we are in the region, we negotiate, we talked several times to Armenian Prime Minister. I was present in some meetings. It was partly due to the Armenian diaspora in the Western countries. They discouraged Armenian government from making any peace, any reasonable, any fair peace. My question to the panelists is mainly about this. What do you think from now on? There is an opportunity for a fair peace based on this deal. Could Armenian government get feel itself free from these radical diaspora elements, and can they make a peace with Azerbaijan on the basis of UN Security Council resolutions?
Thank you, Ahmed. Thank you, Ahmed. Neil,
Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Neil or Dennis, would you like to respond?
Okay, well, I think that the situation that we have now creates some opportunities, because the agreement of the 10th of November speaks about the opening up of transport corridors and communication. This has been one of the biggest problems of the South Caucasus over the last 30 years, that communication was not possible. The border between Turkey and Armenia was closed, between Azerbaijan and Armenia was closed, between Russia and Georgia was sometimes closed as well. So there are all these political complications that have impeded connectivity and trade and good relations between people and between countries. So there is a chance that the new agreement can trigger some new activity in this regard, which is why I want to go back to a point I made earlier on. The provisions of this agreement should be brought into an international context, either at the United Nations through a United Nations Security Council resolution, or in some other format, possibly the OSCE format. The Minsk group, which is the only thing that exists, but it's also in the mind of many, the process is broken, and so it has to be fixed because before it can play a constructive role. But I think there is an opportunity here for taking this to a different level now in terms of dialogue, in terms of opening up communications that would enable...
Ahmed Yildiz was back on the list.
Thank you.
Neil, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I think if I could just add to that, I mean, I think in response to the question, I mean, Armenia, there were two main reasons, I think, why from the Armenian side we didn't get progress over the past 30 years. One was because, of course, they felt that they held the high ground, literally and sort of politically, and that they'd won the war, they had the buffer states, and they had the military on the ground. But secondly, they never felt that there was a security option on the table that would guarantee the security of the Armenian Karabakh community and of the Armenian sort of interests more broadly. So it seems to me that it's now incumbent on the international community, but particularly I would say on Azerbaijan and Turkey, that the transition, the return or the reoccupation of the occupied territories by Azerbaijan demonstrates that it's done in a sensitive way to Armenian cultural heritage, to the Armenian community, those who may remain in those territories, if there are any. And then they need to come up, I think, with a convincing solution to the autonomy status of Karabakh that is going to actually persuade the Armenians in Armenia, but particularly the Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh, that they would have a future in that territory if there was to be a shift towards Azerbaijan having a much stronger role to play in the governance of those territories which remain under Armenian control. So, I mean, this seems to me the political situation that needs to happen. Now, the deal itself gives no indication, the ceasefire gives no indication on any of those fundamental questions. I mean, this is the paucity of the agreement. But it's also, I think, incumbent now upon Russia not to just sit there for the next 5 years and use its forces on the ground to its advantage. It also needs to come up with a diplomatic solution to the autonomy status that will also guarantee the rights of returning Azerbaijanis, but also the rights and protection of the Armenians who are living in those territories and their cultural history. So I think, I mean, this is where it seems to me that we need to really try and focus our efforts, because at least looking on social media at the moment, there are some very disturbing images about what is happening when the formerly occupied territories are coming back under Azeri control. There's many unanswered questions also about what the Armenians are doing as they leave those territories. So this is a key moment when we shouldn't sort of take our eyes off the ball regarding the ultimate political solution to the crisis.
Thank you. I would just observe, based on history and based on the mass fleeing of Armenians in reoccupied Azerbaijani parts of the territory in question, I think that's going to be a very difficult proposition to ever win that confidence that we can live side by side again. But we'll see. I certainly hope some kind of solution is possible, but I think that's easier said than done. Our next question is Andrea Vargadan from Hungary. Andrea.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon for everybody, and congratulations again for the new president. And I hope that everybody will be healthy in the future and good health for everybody. Is it possible to ask you about coronavirus disease in these countries, or only political question, or can I ask you about the pandemic problems? I reviewed the mortality data for Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan per 1 million inhabitants, and the result is extremely interesting. In Azerbaijan had died per 1 million inhabitants 131 people. 316 people had died per 1 million inhabitants in Georgia, and 700 people had died per 1 million inhabitants in Armenia. It's very interesting because it means that more than 5 times as many died in Armenia as in Azerbaijan, for example, and more than twice as many as in Georgia. Do you have any explanation for this? The differences in healthcare, or are the encounters rarer during which the infection could have been obtained? Or has the conflict caused difficulties in the healthcare system in the countries of the Caucasus? What do you think about these many different positions in coronavirus disease in these countries? Thank you for your answer, if you can.
Neil or Dennis?
Okay, if I can, first of all, I want to remind what I said at the beginning, that Georgia took a very different approach right at the beginning with a very tough lockdown. And this gave some very good results, but could not be sustained going forward, simply because it created a huge difficulty in the economy. I would say that the difference between Armenia and Azerbaijan is also related somehow to the demography. Azerbaijan has a much younger population than the other 2 countries, and so this may have impacted the number of deaths as well. But to give some idea of where we are with coronavirus at the moment, so the region as a whole, the three countries together, there are about 400,000 cases that have been reported since the beginning of the year, and nearly 5,000 people have died. So this is as many people have died of coronavirus as probably have died in the Karabakh war. These are sobering figures. The three countries still have a big challenge ahead on this issue because the health services were not as developed as they should have been. There were, well, in some countries they were a bit better than in others, but it exposed also a weakness in this area that I think governments will have to deal with going forward. So as with every other part of the world, now the hope is that a vaccine will come in time so that within 2 or 3 months they can reverse the trend and bring the countries back to some normality. And I want to emphasize, from an economic point of view, this pandemic has been hugely costly for the three countries and accentuated some problems that have been there for a while.
Thank you very much. Now, just a warning, it is 10:11, well, in Washington time, it's 10:11, and we are scheduled to end at 10:30. That gives us 19 minutes. So I urge people to try to be concise in their comments or questions. And now I call on Victor Gibarian from Armenia.
Thank you very much, first of all, for organizing this event. It's very important that you discuss this important issue now. You are very right when you say the situation in South Caucasus has been changed dramatically, and this region of the world was much more safer and stable until 2 months ago. And that Turkey played really a decisive role in this conflict. Turkey brought high-level advisors to Azerbaijan, weaponaries, etc., etc. But what is most worrying is the issue of foreign terrorist fighters that I think the Western community, NATO and the EU have to reflect on. It makes the region really unsafe, and we read in the also open sources that right now, more terrorists are brought to Azerbaijan and in the region close to Nagorno-Karabakh, which is also neighboring Iran. So it is a security challenge not only for this region, but also for Europe. As of the reconciliation issue between Armenia and Turkey that our friend from Turkey mentioned, it's simply not true. Armenia signed a rapprochement agreement with Turkey in 2008. With Turkey. Until now, unfortunately, the agreement is not verified by the Turkish parliament. So I urge my colleague, as he is a parliamentarian, to lobby to ratify the agreement so the relations between Armenia and Turkey will be, well, better, and we can open the border and open embassies. I would like to ask our friends from European community to react on the issue of the terrorists. This is a key issue, security threat in this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. Dennis or Neil?
Sorry, Neil, carry on.
I'll be quick. Yeah. No, I think this issue of the reports around the fighters being moved from Syria to the South Caucasus, I mean, this underlines the dangers of the South Caucasus and the Middle East conflict spaces beginning to merge together. And so I think this is why I made the comment that for the transatlantic community, a key part now of restabilizing or making efforts to restabilize the South Caucasus has to be a dialogue with Turkey about how we can together have a more sustainable engagement in this region, and about how we should certainly make sure that there are no terrorists who are transiting from one region to the other region. And so, I mean, I think a fundamental starting point has to be to re-engage Turkey and to re-energize that relationship. But I think, I mean, there is a broader point here as well, which is, of course, I mean, there is the allegations around the terrorist fighters of that Turkey has increased its security presence in the region. But we've had now 20 years in which there's been a massive buildup of military force across the South Caucasus in general. I mean, it's in Georgia with the Russian presence, it's in Azerbaijan and Armenia where they've been buying large amounts of weapons. So I think all of these questions around security have to be put into the wider framework. And I think I would join Dennis in saying that from the European side, we have to also look at the OSCE and how to reinvigorate those aspects of arms control and confidence building, military to military relations, which have all decayed over the last 2 decades, because actually finding a solution to the South Caucasus is going to require quite a number of different vectors, political, diplomatic, but also military.
Thank you. Dennis, did you want to comment?
Yeah, very quick comment, particularly on the issue of normalization of relations between Armenia and Turkey. I really think that this would be something to work towards. I think a number of the issues that perhaps were an obstacle for this happening in 2008 may now by default have resolved themselves. Perhaps there are new ones, however, but certainly if it is possible to bring this issue back on the agenda, it should be. As I already mentioned, I think that it is important that we understand that a successful Armenia is now in the interest of everybody. With regards to the issue of the jihadist fighters, well, there are credible reports that there were some elements of fighters from Syria transported to the conflict zone. There are reports of others also on both sides. I want to make one point here, however. It's very important for our Armenian colleagues to really be clear in their head that what happened was not the result of these mercenaries. What happened was the result of something much more complicated, much more complex, and also partly the result of a huge Azerbaijani investment in its military force, in its defense sector over the last 20 years. The work for this moment has been going on for a very long time. So it's important to look at this issue of these jihadi fighters, but to look at it also in a context and not to try to blow it out of proportion to the point where we stop understanding what really actually happened.
Thank you. Next is Ziafet Askarov from Azerbaijan.
Вы меня слышите? Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Yes, yes. Good afternoon. Hello, I welcome you all. Mr. President, congratulations, first of all, to you, to the election of the President of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Dear speakers, dear friends, here, colleague from Armenia mentioned some kind of terrorist, etc. First of all, let's speak with facts and documents. In due terms, when the war was on, President of France called our president and was saying the following: we got this evidence, we got some information, what would you say? And our president responded, okay, give us the evidence. Give us the evidence. Do you have any evidence? Not a single terrorist was transferred to the territory of Azerbaijan. While, on the contrary, we know that Armenia attracted from Lebanon, from Greece, from Iraq, they brought terrorists, including both Armenian origin and non-Armenian origin. We do have documents, and we provided these documents to corresponding institutions. Secondly, dear friends, I would like for our friends, our speakers would speak about the international legal sense of this conflict. You all know that the Security Council of the United Nations has 4 resolutions on the issue, saying that these are Azeri lands. We're bringing back our lands, and we'll continue doing that. And historically and legally, there's our Azeri lands. That's what we should be talking about. Blaming Turkey, that Turkey assists Azerbaijan. You know, Turkey assists us morally and politically. In political sense, Turkey is a friendly country to us. Also, Turkey supports the territory of Azerbaijan. That is the territory recognized by international law. And also, Turkey is a member to the Minsk OSCE group. Does it mean that those who support international law is the enemy of Armenia? Shall we take this way? You know, what we should say as it is. I will give you a couple of examples when during the war, Armenia used both missiles, phosphor bombs against civilians. And Armenia violated aggressively all the rules of war, including the humanitarian norms. Our cities and towns were subjected to bombardment. As a result of it, 94 Azeri civilians perished, including children and women. More than 400 civilians were wounded. More than 4,000 of residential blocks of flats were destroyed. When the Armenians leave Akhtarsky district, they burn forest. They burn all forest. How should we take it? These are the houses built by the Azeris, but they were legally settled there. And this is a military, it's a crime of war. As far as the terrorists are concerned, those transferred to Armenia, the other evidence is that the fact that Armenia hasn't signed the Convention of 1979, saying that which use of militants and transferring them to the war zone is prohibited. Until now, still Armenia failed to sign it. Why? Why Azerbaijan has signed this convention? We have signed it. We joined it. We, even if we wanted, господин Asgarov.
К тому же войну выиграла азербайджанская армия, а не какие-то террористы. Армия, наша армия выиграла войну, понимаете? Мы освободили свои земли. А что касается международных организаций, я заканчиваю, пожалуйста, я заканчиваю.
Let me finish. Пожалуйста. Господин Asgarov.
A passionate presentation, but we have 7 minutes left in this seminar, and if you have a question, I would beg you to make it.
Just 1 minute. As far as the European Union is concerned, the European Union signed the documents and adopted the resolution. The Council of Europe, other than these 4 UN resolutions, Islamic conferences, and also non-aligned countries, non-aligned movement, which includes 120 countries. They all adopted documents that the territory of Azerbaijan was occupied. 20% of the territory was occupied. And I'm asking, where was the European Union, where we have 1 million of civilians they had to leave their territories. Nobody thought about them. For the 30 years we've been talking, we've been saying, let's discuss it in a peaceful way. As soon as we started liberating our land, everybody just remembered that the president of France is saying, Mr. Macron, yes, by law, it's a territory of Azerbaijan. And, извините.
Mr. Asgharof's presentation, but we need to move on. We have now 5 minutes, and the last person I'm going to recognize, is Lord Anderson of Swansea. Lord Anderson.
Finality in the current position.
Lord Anderson, if you could,
sorry.
There you go.
Yep, here we go. We know that there is a new reality. There is a new reality. Is it in the view of our speakers that this will last, or will either side accept this? Will the Azeris seek to move further into Nagorno-Karabakh? Will the Armenians nurse their wounds and try to regain it?
Thank you, Lord Anderson. Neil and Dennis.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lord Anderson, for the question. I mean, what we know of these kind of conflicts in the post-Soviet states is that they're not resolved, so they will continue to evolve. And so I think this is the big risk, is we have a ceasefire but no final peace agreement. And very, very big questions, as I think we've highlighted in our discussion, that are still open. And I think this is why I would underline, also in response to the previous questioning, is that I mean, the territorial integrity of the state is certainly one aspect of the question. Now, part of that has been resolved by the conflict itself in terms of the return of the occupied territories, and that there is now the Lachin corridor, the land link between Karabakh and Armenia, which Azerbaijan appears to have accepted. And this was always those were key elements of the so-called Madrid principles. But what we don't have yet is the question about the final status of Karabakh, and about how the Karabakh Armenians will be protected, and about how those Azeris who were displaced in 1994 may return to what the sort of rump Karabakh that is left. So I think this is incumbent now upon Azerbaijan to set out how it is going to do that and how it's going to reassure those communities, because what we've seen in the last couple of months, of course, is the terrible costs of not pursuing a political solution, but rather adopting a military solution. Is that there are now allegations of terrorists on both sides, of war crimes. I mean, there are certainly thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands of casualties. We don't know how many people have died in Azerbaijan fighting, because they haven't released figures around this. And of course, it has not made relations any better. One side has lost and one side has won. There is a bitterness now that has been dug even deeper in the region and will not be overcome by further military action. So the long-term stability and peace in the South Caucasus is going to require a reaffirmation of politics and diplomacy around the conflict. And so we have 5 years, essentially, because that is the mandate of the Russian forces on the ground. And once that comes up, of course, there are going to be another that'll be certainly a risky time about what will happen at that moment. So I think the gun is now started, not just for the war, but for trying to find peaceful solutions. And I hope that we can re-engage, particularly on the transatlantic side, because our voice needs to be heard in this conversation.
If I may add just one comment on this, which is that what we have is Putin's peace. The Russian peacekeepers, Neil is very optimistic in thinking that after 5 years they will say, oh, the mandate has expired, so we'll leave. The experience of Russian peacekeeping in the former Soviet Union does not tell us that the Russians leave whenever their mandate expires. And they always find some reason or some way of staying on. And so this is why this peacekeeping operation, if it is to be a peacekeeping operation, has to be properly organized under an international mandate, even if it's all Russian force, but at least the framework needs to be supported by the international community. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The hour of 10:30 Washington time has now arrived. And I think we've had a robust discussion. I wish we had more time so that everybody could be heard. And my apologies for those who are in the queue, but we couldn't get to. But time limitations makes that imperative. So, this is a very difficult set of issues, especially having a very uneasy ceasefire in place now with Russian peacekeeping troops. And the involvement of a NATO member in this conflict. I know feelings are high. The conflict on Nagorno-Karabakh has been one that's been debated at every NATO parliamentary meeting I've attended over an 8 or 9 year period. And I wish we could have a resolution so that that might change, but I don't think that's going to be in our imminent future. In any event, I hope this discussion has maybe provoked some thoughts about roles and interests, and clearly laid out some challenges we're going to have to face as the transatlantic alliance over the next number of years. I want to thank our panelists. Amanda, I'm sorry we lost you again, but thank you. Neil and Dennis, thank you so much for your thoughtful responses. Thank you again to our Secretariat staff, and thanks to the many attendees who got on this virtual webinar. And again, thank you to the Rose Roth program for promoting this kind of lively discussion. And with that, we are closed.